There is a long and painful history of the Gemara being censored in Christian lands, but in 1728, a draconian form of censorship led to the publication of a heavily redacted Maseches Berachos. A fierce debate erupted within the Jewish community. Was it better to print a mutilated Gemara or not to print it at all? In this class, we explore the rabbinic voices on both sides, the arguments they advanced, and actual examples of the edits. It's a compelling glimpse into a community grappling with impossible choices under the weight of galus. A link to this 1728 edition of Maseches Berachos can be found in the class description.
There was a rabbi in the 1700s by the name of Rabbi Moshe Chagiz. Rabbi Moshe Chagiz was born in Yerushalayim, but he made his way to Europe as a shliach to raise funds for the community in Eretz Yisrael. And as a result, he spent a good few decades of his life in different various cities around Europe. In the year 1726, he's in Altena, which is today part of Hamburg in Germany. And it's there, in Erev Rosh Chodesh Teves, in the year Tov Pei Zayin, which comes out to 1726, that he writes a letter. How do we have this letter? It was copied and exists today, as far as I know, only in a manuscript in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, in a book that is called Gachal Ha'esh. This is a collection of different letters that were written during the 18th century. Most of it has to do with Shabtai Tzvi related controversies. And so this letter from Rav Moshe Chagiz, written in Teves of 1726, is in this manuscript that's today in the Bodleian Library. And let's have a read. Let's read this letter. He's writing to the Polish city of Kalisz. He's writing to all the rabbis of the city, led by the rabbi Rav Goyin Agadol Yitzchok Zelig. Yitzchok Zelig was the Av Bezdin of Kalisz at that time. He goes on to say that today there is a fire burning, and he goes on to say, what is this fire that is the problem? He says that secretly there were people there were certain Eze Yechidim, individuals, who have created an ambush in the holy city of Prague, and they reached out to attack the jewelry of the Jewish people. HaNefesh v'Halach Hashem is a pasuk in Yeshaya. It means the jewelry of the Jewish people, referring to the Gadol, the crown jewel of the Jews. They've schemed, and they basically took permission. They got permission from the Chachamim. Which Chachamim? The Koimrim, the priests. Hayezvisher, the Jesuits. They got permission from the Jesuits in order to print the Gemara. Here's a key word, kikabalasam, according to their tradition. That's a very, very interesting word. When you say someone is printing, they got permission to print the Gemara according to the non-Jewish tradition. What does that mean? It means that it's going to be edited and endorsed by the Jesuits. And the Jewish community, the shepherds, the leaders of the Jewish community, they missed the opportunity to stop this. And already Maseches Berachos, the first Masechta, went to the press. And they have a whole list from the Jesuits of what they have to add and what they have to take away in which area of the Gemara, in the Agados, in the Agadata. So in other words, in the legal sections of the Gemara, Maseches Berachos, the implication here is that there is zero effect, but when it comes to the Agadata, there is a list that came from the Jesuits that said what has to come in, what has to go out. By the way, it's one thing to say something has to go out, it's a whole other thing to say something needs to go in. And so this is the fire that's burning in the Jewish community in Prague. And he goes on to say, Rav Moshe Chagiz does, that if we're going to be quiet, if we're not going to do something about this now, ein la davar soif, v'ayan kach ula machar kach. In other words, the slippery slope. If this is okay, then where does this end? Where does this stop? Suddenly they could come to every single one of our texts and tell us exactly what we're allowed to produce and what not. And so really, and he goes on to say that it's not entirely clear reading the manuscript what exactly he's saying, but the implication is that if we could talk openly about this, we would, but we can't. And that's because they have the legal backing. They're working with the Jesuits. The people who printed this have the legal backing, so we can't really do much. But if we do have the opportunity, eventually we're going to come out very strong. And we're going to tell everyone, Bishalmi hara azois, who is behind this? And in fact, the word Bishalmi in this Ksav Yad, in the manuscript, is written in non-cursive, big letters, mi with a Rosh Tevis, indicating that somehow there's some remez in this word, and we'll come back to that later. So anyway, we're going to come out and we're going to designate exactly who this is, and we're going to label him, just like he references the story of Sheva ben Bichri. Sheva ben Bichri was one of the people who rebelled against David HaMelech. And what happens is Yoav goes up and lays siege and says, this whole city is going to suffer unless you give us Sheva ben Bichri. And he labeled and he named and designated Sheva ben Bichri. So in a similar sense, he's saying that we're going to come out and say exactly who this person is. And it's also interesting to note that earlier he was talking about a group of people who did this, Eze Yechidim, and suddenly now he seamlessly transitioned to talk about one person. In other words, it's probably, as very often projects, there's multiple people involved, but then there's one person who is more responsible than others. And he says that we're going to name this person, and he says this person joined forces, like Sheva ben Bichri originally in biblical times, rebelled against David HaMelech, and he uses that type of language over here, indicating at the time in Prague, the Rav, his name was David Oppenheim. And the language over here seems to say that this group, this printing, is associated with those people who are rebelling against our David, against the Rav in Prague, David Oppenheim. And he goes on to say, we have limsar gufa nefesh v'chol machmad kedei lavadlo. We have to have Mesiras Nefesh. We have to be willing to give up everything to get to combat this decree of where they're tampering with our Gemara. Then he goes on to say in this letter, remember he's writing to the Rabbanim in Poland. Why am I writing to you? Because rumor has it that he's going to try to get haskamas from the Rabbanim in Poland. And so therefore I have no choice. I have an obligation to reveal to you, rabbis in Poland, that all of their excuses about why they did this project is only an achizas anayim, it's only a mirage. Anyone who has the ability to see would see through their arguments. And therefore you guys should preempt this situation and come out with a ban and basically say that no one is allowed to buy any Gemara printed in Prague for the last 10 years. Now, in addition to the Gemara, he goes on to say that this applies also to a Siddur and a Chumash. In other words, the implication here is that in addition to this Gemara, which is the primary focus, there was also a Siddur, at least a Siddur, that was also printed, that was also censored, that is also problematic. He mentions also here a Chumash. We're not going to go too far into that, into the Siddur and our Chumash. Our focus over here is going to be the Gemara. He goes on to say, don't buy anything purchased in the last 10 years. We need to look into that, why he's choosing the number the last 10 years, because the Gemara we know was printed around this time, 1726, 1727, those years, Tov Pei Zayin, Tov Pei Ches. Okay, and now he turns to them and he's basically saying, you guys should come out of ban basically and say, no one could buy this Gemara. And I hope he says, that you're going to do what your obligation is, the way you know how to do it. And also write to the other communities. I'm only writing to you, Kalish. You write to the other Rabbanim, and everyone should come out against this Gemara. He signs his name, Moshe Ze'ira Yerushalayim, the small Moshe from Yerushalayim Chagiz. I'm living here in the Kehillah Kedosha of Altona. As I said before, Altona is part of Hamburg today. Erev Reish Chodesh Teves Shnas Loi Suchal. If you do the math, Loi Suchal comes out to the year Tov Pei Zayin, which is the year, because it's Erev Reish Chodesh Teves, it is the year 1726. This is the letter that Moshe Chagiz writes to Rabbi Yitzchak Zelig, the Av Bezdin in Kalish. We want to learn and understand and explore what is this Gemara, what is the story behind this Gemara, who are the people behind this Gemara, what did they do, why did they do, when did they do, etc., etc. For that, if you don't mind flipping off the light just for a few moments, and you can turn around, and we are going to now look at the screen. So for starters, here is the manuscript that I was referring to earlier. On the left-hand side this is the Gachal Hayesh. This is where this letter from Rav Moshe Chagiz is written out. This is not his handwriting. Whoever is the one who composed this manuscript copied his letter into this book. That here is the last page. You could see on the bottom right is where he gives the year Loi Suchal Leis Alem Leprat Katan. Okay, what is this letter that Rav Moshe Chagiz is writing about? It has to do with this. Here is a title page for a Gemara. Although, when you look at the title page, you actually may not know it's a Gemara. And that's because it doesn't say Talmud, Bavli, Maseches Berachos. It doesn't even say Gemara Berachos. It says Hilchos Berachos. It doesn't even say Maseches Berachos. Okay, so let's back up a little. Censorship for the Gemara began, or a big problem for the printing of the Gemara began in 1559, when the Pope placed the Gemara on the index of banned books. As a result, the next printing of the Gemara that happened in Basel, today in Switzerland, was printed in 1578, 1580. The word Talmud was not used in that printing. We had the opportunity of speaking about this once in a previous class. Instead, it just said Maseches Berachos, Maseches Shabbos, because the word Talmud, the Pope banned Talmud, so you can't say now it's mutter, so it was printed under a different name, and also it was censored. And as we go through today's class, we'll be talking about the differences between the Basel censorship and the censorship before us. Here, not only you can't use Talmud and Gemara, but in addition, you can't even use the word Maseches or Masechta. And so therefore it just says Halachis, Hilchos Berachos. Now, let's go in further to read some more information about the printing. You can see it says, Nitfas Poi Kilas Kodesh Prague Habira. It is printed in Prague. But right above that, there's a paragraph. And I'm going to summarize what this paragraph says. All of the people who were appointed by Adenenu Achasid HaKeser, it says Carlos, but it means Charles. The name Charles, Carlos, the same name. Charles the Sixth. So he's the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. All of the officers who were appointed by him to oversee printing, they all agreed and they all gave permission that li is galus l'chol, that it's this revealed to everyone. This is open, that there's nothing wrong. There's no hate in this book. We could sing this openly out in the streets. There's no fear about anything. Why? Because loy nimtza boy davar hamisnaked ledasam bishum pina. There's nothing here against the other religion whatsoever. So this can be an open endeavor, completely legal. Everything is fine about this. And then it says further down, it says cum licentia superium, which means with permission of the superiors, which is a very common thing for it to say on books printed in Catholic countries. That just means it's a legal book. And then the year for printing is a tuf and a beis and a vav and a lamed and a nun. If you do the math, it comes out to tuf peicheth, which is the year 1728. Remember, Rabbi Moshe Chagiz's letter is tuf peizayin, so it's actually a year written. That letter is dated a year before the dating on this title page, and then on the bottom line it says who the printers are. Yehuda Beck, okay, is the printer of this work. Here is the final page. The last page has more information about the printers, if we're interested. It says there's the man in bigger font. It says his name is Meir, the son of Naphtali Kasowitz, and it says he was in charge of the Pressenseer. Pressenseer, as far as I understand, is he made the letters, the actual type. He carved the actual type letters that were used in this print. Under it, it gives three names of three individuals, and they call them the Zetzers. You probably heard the term the Bacha the Zetzer. That's the person who actually does the typesetting, where they literally put the letters, each one in its place, for the print. I guess that's less chashuv than being the person who actually makes the type. And here are the names of the people who are involved in the printing. Now, when we go through this Gemara, it kind of seems straightforward and like a typical regular Gemara when you look at it at first glance. Here you're looking at Daf Beis of the Gemara, Daf Beis Amud Aleph, Daf Beis Amud Beis. Looks like the typical Gemara, and in fact, it has the same number of dafim as the standard Gemaras. Remember, the dafim standardization already had occurred with the Bamberg Shas in the 1520s, and pretty much stayed standard from print to print to print, and that spills over here as well. In other words, and it has Rashi and it has Tosfos, so in that regard, it's a pretty standard Gemara like many others. In the back of the Gemara, you have Piskei Tosfos, and that's a summary of the rulings that emerge in Tosfos. That's a pretty standard thing to have. You have the Pirush HaMishnayos LaHarambam on Maseches Berachos. You have that in the back as well. Also a pretty standard thing to have. Then you get something that's very unstandard. And that is, it says, Pirush Liksas Agadis b'Maseches Berachos. You have a commentary to some of the Agadis, the non-legal sections in Maseches Berachos. Here there are 32 pieces of commentary, no name, we don't know who authored it, 32 pieces of commentary. This is highly unusual. We'll come back to this later on. In fact, along the way in the Gemara, it refers you to this Pirush in the back. So if you're looking right here, you see on the left-hand side, we're looking now on Daf Hey. In the left margin, it says, Al zeh yesh pirush ayin lekamon daf samach zayin. Right? That's what it says, right over there on the left. Let me get this on. Here. Al zeh yesh pirush ayin lekamon daf samach zayin. Here again, Al zeh yesh pirush ayin lekamon daf samach zayin. That's to this anonymous pirush that appears at the end of the Gemara. After that pirush, we return to being a standard Gemara. We have on the right-hand side, you see how on the top of the page there's the Pirush of the Maharshal, Reb Shlomo Luria. Under that, the Pirush of the Maharsha. And then on the left-hand side is the next section of this Gemara of the Pirush of the Rosh, also very standard in Gemaras, surrounded by the commentary of Reb Yomtiv Lipman Heller, who lived in the 1600s, who wrote a Pirush on two Pirushim on the Rosh, and this was published here in this edition of the Gemara. Okay, but we already know that Rav Moshe Chagiz said that this Gemara has a lot of censorship. It has things that are missing and things that are added. When you flip through the pages, things that are missing and things that were added. When you flip through the pages, the most apparent page, the most unusual page is this one, Daf Vav Amud Aleph, because you see it here placed. On the right-hand side, you see Daf Hey Amid Beis. On the left-hand side, you see Daf Vav Amid Aleph. And basically, Daf Vav Amid Aleph looks like it's only half of the material. A lot of material is missing. This is the only page that really looks this bad in this printing of Hilchos Berachos, Prague, 1728. And there's a reason for this. The reason for this is there's an entire shtickle in the Gemara on Daf Vav that begins with Amar Rav Oven Bar Ado, Amar Rav Yitzchak, Minayin Sha'Kadosh Baruch Hu Meniach Tefillin. How do we know that God dons tefillin? And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's about 15 lines of Gemara on Daf Vav Amud Aleph about Hashem putting on tefillin. This passage is completely removed from Daf Vav in this edition in Prague. But remember, they need the dafim to remain aligned with the traditional number. And so the result is just having this gap right there in the page, that in order to keep the other pages consistent with each other. What's going on over here? Why would someone not want this passage in the Gemara? So it's not so difficult to understand. Generally, there's a long tradition, many centuries of Christian claims against the Gemara, and specifically against the Agadas of Gemara, and specifically against those Agadas in the Gemara that are anthropomorphic. Specifically, that means, that's a big word to mean, when you use physical language to talk about Hashem. So talking about Hashem wearing tefillin, and what does it say in the tefillin, and how many batim are the tefillin, etc., is very anthropomorphic. This is something that Christians had tightness on for many centuries, so it's not surprising that if there's going to be a Gemara that has aggressive censorship, that this is going to be slated for deletion. I should point out that in the Basel edition of the Gemara, which I spoke about before, which was censored, most of the censorship there had to do with things that were overtly anti-Christian. There's nothing overtly anti-Christian about this passage. This passage in the Basel edition is left alone, no problem whatsoever. But over here, it's removed. And here you're starting to see why we're in new territory over here. When a passage like this, there's nothing anti-Christian about it, but it comes out because the Jesuits say, hey, this is heresy. And they're telling us what's considered heresy. So you can understand why this is a new step, and why this is something that makes someone like Moshe Chagiz upset. Let's move along and look at some other examples of censorship in this Gemara. In Berachos Tav Zayin Amud Aleph, there is a very famous passage. Minayin sha'Kadosh Baruch Hu mispalel. How do we know that Hashem davens? Well, when you look at this passage in the Prague edition, the word is changed. Minayin sha'Kadosh Baruch Hu mevakesh. It's not mispalel, it's mevakesh. And if you continue, the Gemara originally says my mitzli or matzli. And that's the Aramaic word for davening. What does he pray for? Well, in the Prague edition, it was changed to ma oimer. What does he say? So in this way, the word prayer basically is a bad word. So you have, instead of mispalo, you have mavakesh. Instead of ma matzli, you have ma oimer. And again over here, mavakesh instead of mispalo. Now, what happens is, what is the tefillah? So the original Gemara says, he says, Yiratzah melofana, it should be my will, sheyichbeshu rachami eskasi. God is saying, my compassion should prevail over my anger. Here it was changed. Instead of saying that, it says, Mi yitain, if only sheyasu banai ritzoni, that the Jewish people do my will, so that then my compassion will prevail over my anger. Okay, so what happened over here? We can imagine what happened over here. What does this mean? Hashem is praying. That itself is anthropomorphic. What does it mean to pray? That means there's something, you pray when there's an authority higher than you, but there's no authority higher than Hashem. So how can you say Hashem is praying? That's problem number one. Problem number two is, what does it mean that Hashem would say, if only my rachamim prevailed over my anger? Just do it. What are you praying about? But he solved both problems, because it just says, what does it mean, mevakesh? Mevakesh, that God wants something. So it doesn't say, it's less implying that there's something above you. And the prayer itself, or the request itself, is not that I should do something. If only what I seek is that my children, the Jewish people, should do my will, so that b'derech mamela, as a result, my rachamim will prevail over my kas. This is another example, left alone in the Basel Talmud, no problem whatsoever, amended over here. Now, we're going to move to another category of changes in this Gemara. Here are things where we will say that this looks or appears or is somewhat anti-Gentile, and it gets affected in the Prague edition. So in the Gemara you have over here, Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, Gemara Berachos says that Hashem, Moshe Rabbeinu asked multiple things of Hashem, and one of those things is, Bikei shaloi tishra shchina al oivdei kochav. He asked that the Shechina should not rest on idolaters. So let's look over here at what they did in the Prague edition. It says, Bikei shaloi tishra shchina oz rak al Yisrael. So, the request, the way it's framed here, is only something us that was then. So the request is not something, the way you read it in the typical Gemara, it's a request that exists today as well. Bikei shetisha shchina al Yisrael. And the way it's there is only us, that it only had to do with them. So it's limiting the scope of this prayer. We then have a Gemara in Brachos, Taf Chav Ches Amud Beis Chav Tes Amud Aleph, where it speaks about the bracha that we say in Shemana Esrei, V'lam al shinim al tihi sikva. There's different nuschos about that bracha. That's a nusach Chabad. Anyway, in this Gemara, in our Gemara it says, it calls it Birchas HaTzedukim. Now the truth is that itself was introduced in Basel. It used to be Birchas HaMinim, but the Basel Gemara didn't like that. Minim is anti-Christian, so let's make it about Tzedukim. So now it's not about us Christians. That entire passage was removed from this Gemara. So now you don't even have it at all. In Prague, it was removed. You have I'll move a second. It says, it goes, I'll say to B'yavna, Amar Abaya, it just jumps from here. It jumps from I'll say to B'yavna, it jumps from B'yavna to Amar Abaya. The entire passage about Birchas Haminim has been removed. Gemara Berachos Daf Nun Daled Amud Aleph says that a place, Makom Shenekra Mimenu Akum, a place where Avodah Zarah has been removed. Omer, a person says, Baruch Sha'akar Akum Eretzeinu, thank God that Avodah Zarah has been removed from our land. In this Gemara it says, Haba le'Eretz Yisrael. Prague says, it really defines, this is not talking about anywhere. If you come to Eretz Yisrael, V'ra Makam, and you saw a place where the Asherah is Canaanim, where the Asherah of the Canaanites were removed, then you make a bracha. In other words, very, very clear, removing this from anything that anyone may think has to do with Christianity. Dav Daled Amud Beis. Now we're going to move to another another category, where the censorship is about taking a teaching of the Gemara and saying this only really applies to Jews. Don't think this applies to non-Jews. The Gemara in Brachos Dav Daled Amud Beis says that any person who's over al divrei chachamim in terms of violates the words of the sages in terms of the proper time of saying Shema, chayiv misa. This Gemara in Prague says, kol shehu bedas Yehudis. So it's only a Jew. Only a person who's a Jew who is over al divrei chachamim is chayiv misa bidei shamayim. In other words, don't think that this applies to Gentiles. Now, in Basel, this change was not made, although there were other times when it had to do specifically with marriage, that God likes marriage and people are happy when they're married. There, the Basel edition actually qualified it and used the word Jew, and we spoke about that when we spoke about the Basel edition in the previous class. But this is much wider in scope, going to entering this zone of Krishma as well. Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph. Similar thing for whoever doesn't say emes v'yatziv in the morning and emes v'amuna in the evening is not yotzi yadecha v'asoi. So this edition, this Prague edition, qualifies that it's only talking about a Yehudi. And another one, Rabbi Yochanan says on Daf Nut Ches Amud Beis, from the day that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, there is a gzeira on batein shel tzadikin sheyechravu. The homes of the righteous are going to be destroyed. Well, this edition says no, that the negative decrees is only on Jews because of their sins and the things that they rejected, so that shouldn't apply to us. So therefore, it's qualified Batei Toive Yisrael. Only the good Jews, their homes are going to be destroyed, but not the Gentiles. Daf Samach Aleph Amud Aleph. The Gemara says that Hakadosh Baruch Hu bara Yetzer Toiv and Yetzer Ra. That Hashem created two inclinations within the person. That was changed over here. Yesh la'adam. Echad Yetzer Tov, Echad Yetzer Ra, that a person has, does not say that it is created by God. This would probably be because of Christian theology and saying that the devil was created by God as good and then he chose on his own to become bad. So the idea that God created the Yetzer Ra may not sit well with them, and so, nope, we have to change that. Daf Samach Amud Aleph, this moves us to a new category, and that is there's a tendency, anything fantastical, anything that doesn't, generally speaking, when it comes to people's other religions, so even people who in their own religion may believe a lot of things that are fantastical, but when it comes to another religion, all of a sudden they're like, no, that doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. We become very rational about other religions. So that happened over here as well. That's fantastical. How could you say something like that happened? Specifically the story of Dinah on Daf Samach Amud Aleph, where the Gemara says that she originally was created as a boy. But through Leah's prayer, her gender changed and she became a girl. Miyad nefcha lavas is the lashon of the Gemara. Well, that sounds fantastical, and it's changed in this Gemara to where's the lashon? It says miyad nivra'a lebas. So it says she was created as a girl, almost allowing the reader to assume that Leah's prayer happened before she was born, though in the context of the Gemara, that's clearly not the case. This is a good example of trying to reduce things that are fantastical. Here is an interesting one that is, I'm not entirely sure what category to put this in, but let's read. Davav Amud Aleph. The Gemara in Bracha says, Ein tefillah shel adam nishmas ela bebeis hakneses. The prayer of a person is only heard in a shul. Well, that gets changed over here. It says, Tefillah shal adam nishmas biyoyser bebeis hakneses. A person's prayer is heard biyoyser bebeis hakneses. Now, you can understand, what does that mean? A person's prayer is only heard in the shul? Is that really? So prayer outside a shul doesn't work? No, so obviously that doesn't make sense, that doesn't work. Oh, okay, so what is the pshat? It means it's heard more, so say so. So say so. And so that's what ends up happening in this passage. Also, weiter in the same Gemara it says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzoi bebeis hakneses. God is in beis hakneses. What does that mean, God is in the beis hakneses? God's everywhere. What does it mean he's matzoi beis hakneses? So here they added a word. Matzoi beis hakneses biyoser. Okay? So also, instead of the Shechina, in the original Gemara it says, it uses Lashon Shechina imayim. And here it uses the words Elikim imayim. But this is something that's not consistent because I found various times in this Gemara where it did use the word Shechina. So not everything is very clear in terms of why these things were changed, Shechina to Elikim, for example. But the other ones over here, you could understand why these changes were made or asked for. And finally, two more examples. Here you have Gemara Berachos Tav Zayin Amud Beis, where it says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum ben Yochi, Miyayim Shabara HaKadosh Baruch Hu Es ha'olam, for the day God created the world, le'metzinu. Excuse me, lo'haya adam shakara la'kadosh baruch hu adon. No one called God master ad sheba Avram. So in other words, no one recognized God until Avram Avinu. This was changed. Lo'matzinu adam shakara la'kadosh baruch hu adon. We don't find such a person. In other words, it's not stated as a categorical fact. It's stated as something subjective that we didn't find such a person. What might have happened here? Again, impossible to know for sure, but it sounds like this, and there is a trend in some of the other emendations of how would you know? Like were you there? Doesn't say it in Torah Beferish, so how would you know? And so Chazal have secret knowledge? Well, we reject the idea that Chazal have secret knowledge, and so we don't find, not making it categorical. And there are other examples like this, perhaps the last one over here, and this brings us to the Siyum of Maseches Berachos, Daf Samach Daled, Amid Aleph, where it says as follows, Talmidei Chachamim ein la menucha lo b'olam hazeh v'lo b'olam haba. That scholars have no rest, not in this world, not in the next. Well, here, instead of saying that, it just says, Talmidei Chachamim ein la menucha lo b'olam, have no rest at all. It could be what was happening over here is, you know what's going on in Olam Haba? How do you know what's going on in Olam Haba? In other words, an unwillingness to concede that the rabbis at Chazal have knowledge of what's going on in other worlds, and therefore saying that no, it has to be more vague, just Ein la menucha la'olam, without clearly saying that this has to do with Olam Haba. And so, while one of the categories of the amendments that we looked at just now definitely relates to things that may be anti-Christian in one way or another, at least interpreted that way, it definitely goes much beyond that. It goes into things that are seen as not being clear. It goes into things that are in the category of anthropomorphic. It goes into the things that are in the category of how would you know. It goes into things that perhaps Christian doctrine doesn't really like. For example, about the Yetzer Hara, etc., etc., etc. And so here we're dealing with a very, very wide-ranging type of hagois and changes that were made into this Gemara. Unprecedented. Nothing happened at this level. Yes, there were changes made to the Basel Gemara that we've alluded to, but nothing that reaches this level. There are literally hundreds of changes that were made to this Gemara Berachos, and now we can understand what Rav Moshe Chagiz was talking about when he said things that were taken out, but he also things added. When he says things added, he means these types of words that we have been referring to. Okay, so now the question is, why taka is this happening? So to answer to that, we go to 1877, the newspaper Hamagid. In the newspaper Hamagid, which came out in Prussia, there is an article that is produced by a man named Rafal Kirchheim. Rafal Kirchheim was a researcher who lived in the 1800s, and he says as follows: I was doing research in the Jewish community offices in Prague, and I found a ksavis natzlos, an apologetic statement, basically a justification that has to do, and it was amongst a whole bunch of decaying and moldy papers, and it has to do with the printing of the Gemara in the 1720s, and he basically reproduced this over 4 or 5, he serialized this over 4 or 5 editions or gilyanis of this newspaper that came out in 1877. So now let's read what he found, because now we're going to see the other side. We already saw Rav Moshe Chagiz's side. Now let's see the side that says this is a good idea. If you can knock the lights back on right now, because we're done with the PowerPoint. Okay, so if you don't have a handout, there's around, somewhere around, and we are on the first page. Let's have a look at what it says in this memorandum. It opens as follows and says, this is going to be a declaration before all Jewish rabbis to explain why we had this idea of printing the Shas with omissions. And sometimes there is, in the margins, there is a pirush, an explanation about the bizarre agadata. Remember, in the margins, he gives you a note and says, in the back, there's going to be a pirush. So why do we do that? And also, we also change the language sometimes for shemes nirdafim, in other words, synonyms. Which, after looking at what we looked at, it's kind of downplaying the changes. It's just saying synonyms. So an example of that would be, instead of maspalel, I change it to mavakesh. Okay, you could say that's a synonym. But adding, what was that? Shechina Elikim is another example of a synonym, perhaps. But there were some of the changes that don't go into that category, but he doesn't, whoever is writing this doesn't say that, he kind of glosses over that. Okay, so why did we do this edition of the Gemara? So in order to do that, this document memorandum says you need to know some history. We've been having here in Prague, in Bohemia, we've been having persecution against the Gemara. They don't let us print it here. They don't let us import it here from other places. That's because of Pope Clement VIII. He banned the Gemara and said it ought to be burnt. This is referring to what the Pope Clement said in decreed in 1593. And as a result, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, whose name was Rudolf, he allowed Jews to print books in his empire, but he made a condition that said no Gemaras, because he wanted to be loyal to what the Pope was saying. During this period in time, we have had instances of where they would come in the streets and they would take, and no one would stop them, and they would take our books. They took books from, and he mentions 3 prominent rabbis of Prague, all of whom passed away in the decade between 1710 and 1720. In other words, it's the prior generation, or a few years before. Remember, we're in 1727, 1728 now. So the 3 rabbis are Gavriel Esclis, he mentions Rabbi Avram Broda, and he mentions Rabbi Elio Shapiro. Rabbi Elio Shapiro is the author of Elio Zutan Elio Rabbah. They confiscated their books. We can never get them back. And he says, here in Prague, we have a memorandum, he calls it a memorial, that Rabbi Avram Broda wrote, and Rabbi Elio Shapiro wrote. In the name of the leaders of the Jewish community of Prague, they wrote to the authorities, please give us permission to print the Gemara, and we'll do censorship. We'll remove anything that is against your wishes. We'll take it, we'll remove it. But guess what? They were denied. These great Rabbanim, Rabbi Avram Broda and Rabbi Elio Shapiro, the answer was no. And during this, so really, we have no Gemara over here. During this time, there's a Jew from Nikolsburg. His name is Rabbi Yitzchak Moicher Svarim. He sells books. And he tried to clandestinely bring in 8 sets of Shas and the Rif through, he calls them Anshe Harshmanik. I don't know exactly what that means, but they're porters of some sort who are going to bring it in. Anyway, his plan was revealed, and they confiscated the books, and this Rabbi Yitzchak fled. The officials arrested the people of the Harshmanik who were responsible for this, as well as this Rabbi Yitzchak Moicher Svarim was also arrested, and there was a lot of effort that went into getting like a pardon, and the result was that his punishment was only that he had to clean the streets all of them had to clean the streets while they were chained for a year. So a very degrading type of punishment. And the books that he brought were going to be burnt. Where? At the pranger. The pranger is the pillory. This is where in Prague in the 18th century and before, if someone did something wrong, they would have the guy stand there for a day, 2 days with his hands sticking through holes, tied up. It's in the main square of Prague till today. They know exactly where this is, or relatively speaking, and people would go by and abuse and throw things. This was a very, very embarrassing punishment. So they were going to burn the Gemaras at this pillory, and not only these 8 sets, but also all other Sfarim Gemaras that they're able to find, they're burning now at this time. So this is really problematic. Now, the author of this memorandum goes on to say further that I want you to know that in the late 1600s and early 1700s, there was a Gemara printed Holy Roman Empire they're both in the same empire. Prague is, and Frankfurt Oder is also in the same empire, and Gemaras were printed there, and it worked. But you have to understand there's a difference between us and them. Why? Because Prague is Catholic, and Frankfurt Oder is Protestant. Because it's Protestant, by definition, the authorities have to allow Protestant works there. In other words, it's already out of sync with the Catholic Church. So therefore, if they're having Lutheran works there, they could also have Gemaras there. And so it's printed there, and that's why there was permission over there. But here they say we're Catholic. And so Prague is Catholic, even though it's part of the same empire. We have to follow 100% what the Pope says. And so therefore, if we're not allowing Luther's books in, which they're not, so why should we allow the Gemara in? And so therefore, that's why we're being so strict over here. And that's why the rules are strict. And they go on further to say that really they're even unhappy that the books, that the Gemaras were printed in Frankfurt. They think it's a big avla. And so the bottom line is, don't think that because Frankfurt was able to do it, we should be able to do it over here. This is, again, this memorandum writing for all the Chachamim to understand the context and the problem of the times. Now we're going to pause over here, and I want to show you that we know about this problem from elsewhere. The Yavitz wrote an autobiography. He lived at this time, and when he covers the year 1721, he writes that he came to Prague. His autobiography is called Megillah Sefer. He writes that I came to Prague in 1721, and he says this is a very dangerous place for Jews to be because of, he calls them Koiminim Hashchoirim v'Talmideim Hatzi'irim. So Koiminim Hashchoirim, I'm pretty sure, are the Jesuits. The Jesuits, I guess they wore some type of black garment, and so they're called Koiminim Hashchoirim. The Tzi'irim are the Franciscans. So these are Catholic orders of priests that are that have a lot of sway over church policy and, for that matter, government policy during the Middle Ages and even in the 18th century as well. And so they have so much influence over there that they're responsible for all the problems. And he says, when I came, customs took from me the shalos tshuvos of my father that I had. He said, I had a few sets of my father's, a few volumes of my father, Chacham Tzvi. And they took it away from me. And he says it's a big sakana to bring Gemara into the city because the government has banned it. So we know that this memo, and this again is 1721, mamish a few years before this Gemara Berachos is printed. So we understand, we have evidence about this problem from elsewhere as well. Okay, so back to this memo. So what are we going to do about this problem? So we're going to do what the earlier rabbis did. Because remember, they petitioned that we want to print the Gemara in Prague and that we're going to censor it. So let's try again. And we tried again, and we went to the consistory. This is the officials in Prague. They spoke to Father Hasselbauer. Father Hasselbauer is the Jesuit who, and he writes over here, he is in charge of Jewish books. Whether a book is kosher or not kosher, this Jesuit, the government, trusts him to enforce the Pope's policy. And he, in fact, answered that, yes, a Gemara could be printed, but we, the Jesuits, have to edit it. And the Jewish people in Prague was we're very happy, because this is an amazing thing, that we're finally going to be able to have the Gemara and all its commentary saved. Galui l'chol amin. Galui l'chol amin, in other words, that's the same words, if you recall, that was on the title page of the Gemara. This is going to be legal. This is going to be legal. Galui l'chol amin. We're not going to have to hide and try to sneak it in like Yitzchak Meiches Svarim. And there never was such permission where you had the priests, he says, that are called the katholische Geistliche, the spiritual leaders of the Catholic Church, never allowed the Gemara printing. In other words, like this. There's been times the Pope gave permission. There are times that the secular authorities gave permission. But the idea that these radical Christian priests, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, that they should be on board, that actually never happened before. So this is an amazing thing, because now we solve all problems if we go ahead with this. So how are we going to do this? So we chose people from our community, from the community of Prague, who understand things and they know how to debate, and we chose them to debate with the Jesuits about the nature of the amendments and to defend the words of Chazal. And they did the best job that they could do, until that instead of the Jesuits thought they were going to edit and ban most of the Agadas. But instead of that happening, Napoichu, the opposite happened. The majority of the Agadatas actually made it in, and without any complaint. There was only a few where they said you can't print it. For example, the one about Hashem putting on tefillin. It doesn't say over here. And also, we had to change a whole bunch of them, that it doesn't really say so much. Okay. We received a list of all of the things that they wanted changed and the things they wanted omitted. Okay, so what did we do? We had a meeting with the Av Bezdin and the Rosh Hashiva. This is Rabbi Oppenheim, who we mentioned before. Rabbi David Oppenheim. And with all the other Rabbanim of the city. We didn't decide right away. we did halana sadin. We thought we slept on it 2 times, 3 times, and we discussed it. And then we said, you know what? With Gemara Berachos, we could do it. We know exactly what they want. We think it's okay. So Gemara Berachos, yes. In terms of other Masechtas, we don't yet know what they're going to want to change. And so the other Masechtas, there's no permission. But why is this okay? Why is this allowed? So the memorandum goes on to say that the Bezdin, the Rabbanim, wrote a tshuva justifying this. So now it's a story in a story. It's a memo in a memo. There's a tshuva now in the memo. So now let's go to the tshuva that's in the memo. So the tshuva opens like this. The first thing that happens in this tshuva is that it divides Chazal's teaching into 4 categories. Category number 1 is what's called Halacha LaMoshe Sinai. It calls this the highest category, Ein L'mayla Imenu, the teachings that come from Moshe generation after generation. The second category of Torah Sheba'al Peh is halachos that were derived through the Yud Gimel Midos. And it says this is very similar to the first category. Because we received the Midos Shatar and Dreshas Bahem. We received that at Sinai. So when Chazal do the hard work of deriving a new law, Kal V'Chaim, Egzei Shav, Binyanav, whatever it is, so then that's sacrosanct, and that's very, very special. It's almost the same level as Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. But then he goes on to say that there's 2 other categories. The category 3 is what he calls Drashes Chachamenu. And here he gets into a very interesting discussion. Sometimes you have where the Chachamim, they give you a teaching, which it could be in law, or it could be not in law, what happened to Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, something like that. And they tell you a pasuk. They tell you information, and they link it to a pasuk. But the Chazal say that it's called an asmachta. What does it mean, an asmachta? An asmachta, he goes on to say, is not the same thing as a real drasha, a real Yud Gimel Midrash HaTorah Nidreshes Ban. Yud Gimel Midrash HaTorah Nidreshes Ban means this is really what the pasuk is telling you. This is really what Hashem is telling you, and you really derived it from this text. Asmachta means you know this information independently, whether it's a din. Let's say the Chachamim made a din derabbanan. So that came from their own minds, the din derabbanan. But then asmachu akra. What is asmachu akra? You're leaning on the pasuk. In other words, the visualization here is you're not squeezing the pasuk to find what's inside. You have an independent thing, and you're leaning it onto the pasuk. You're saying, by the way, it's marumas in the pasuk. And then it could also happen not for law. It could happen that when Yitzchak was with Yaakov, so he said this, or he came here, and he went there, whatever it is. So there also they may say it's marumas in the pasuk. But lav dafka it's marumas in the pasuk. Really, Chazal had a tradition about it. And they are using the pasuk. Now, why are they doing that? If they had a tradition about it, whether in law or non-law. If they had a tradition, why are they using a pasuk? So he goes on to say the reason, he quotes sources. He quotes the Kuzri, he quotes Rabbi Yeshaya Acharon, he quotes the Rashba, and he quotes Rabbeinu Yoina. 4 Rishonim. And he says, what's the idea? Because it used to be that all the teachings were oral. So you need to remember it. How do you remember it? Well, if you have Torah Shebiksav, and for each word, you're like, that word, I'm going to link this word with this teaching. I'm going to link this word with that teaching. So all of a sudden, when you open now a Chumash or a Navi, the text itself is doing so much more than the text. Because of all these oral traditions that were linked to these psukim. He spent some time on this. And what's he doing? He's trying to say this is its own category. He's setting the stage, you can tell, to say, if in the first 2 categories we can't touch that. That's something we're not going to touch. But in this category, if we ended up touching something, not as bad. He doesn't say it befedish, but that's what it seems like where he's going. And then he comes to the 4th category, where it's going to be the same thing. Now what? The 4th category calls Haggadas Chazal, specifically those Haggadas Chazal that are Zorois, where it's Yoitza min HaHekesh HaTivi. It doesn't make sense. It's fantastical. Then there's another type of Haggadata that's a problem. And that's where it conflicts with what we understand about the world. It conflicts with our understanding of science, like the Rambam discusses. So that's another example. So what's happening here? Here, of course, Chazal had deep meanings in what they were saying. Of course, there's amazing teachings over here. But it's muvam pnimi, and it's kavana nistara. It's a secret meaning. It doesn't mean what you think it means. There's something much more over here. There's a long tradition of rabbis saying this long before this memorandum written in the 1700s, that Agadata has an esoteric meaning, and the Chazal specifically coded it into interesting stories. Those who need to know will know. Those who don't know, don't know. And this is the fourth category. Also, it's not 100% clear, but he also seems to be setting the stage to say that, if we need to mess around with that, then it could be it's worth it if we're salvaging the first two by compromising somewhat on the latter two. Again, he doesn't say this clearly, but it does seem like the memorandum is going in that way. Okay. After he does that, he then goes as follows. There is no doubt that typically a Jew needs to do everything in his power to ensure that the words of Chazal are exactly as is, not adding, not subtracting, not even changing one word. However, in this case, where we know that the Talmud has been persecuted for so long, and it's bari azekoi, we see very clearly that all books that are Talmud related are bisakana atzuma, because we see the book burnings. So therefore, we should not be forbidding to print. And let us get the benefit of having the Gemara printed in a way where it's kula murashim, permitted, gluyim l'chalamim, in a very legal way, open for everyone. Ve'ein dover davar, no one's going to be able to say anything. V'yasara me'aleinu sinas ve'evas hanoitzim, and finally, once and for all, let's get the Christian claims away from us. So if that's the case, v'adai shanochan adavar lases, it's right. Why? Because here he starts, what's the halachic backing to say you're allowed to do this? So he uses halachic terminology. You're allowed to save the shas by amputating one of its limbs. Just like you're allowed to save a person by amputating one of its limbs, you're allowed to save the Gemara by amputating one of his limbs. And here is where he starts, the author of this memo starts bringing sources. So the first source he brings is a very famous issue of a caravan, a Yerushalmi in Trumais, Parakhes, that discusses a caravan of people who are traveling. And bandits surround the caravan and they say, you hand us over one, who we will execute, otherwise we're going to do away with the entire group. We're going to kill the entire group. So the din is, you're not allowed to hand over anyone. Even though it's like, what do you mean? Rather one person die than 10 people die. No, you're not allowed to hand over an innocent person to save the group, because then, in that moment, your hands are involved you're an accomplice to murder, essentially. You're never allowed to be an accomplice to murder, even to save 10 people, therefore you're not allowed to do it. However, the Yerushalmi makes an exception. And it says that if they called out and they said, you have Feivel, and we want Feivel, and they say him by name, then you're allowed to hand him over. If they call him out by name, because why? Because then you're not making the selection. In other words, you can, if they don't call out someone by name, so then how are you going to choose exactly? How are you going to choose? But here they're calling out the name, so yeah, so it's not so chomer, you're allowed to do it. Now here there's a machloikis. The truth is, Rabbi Yochanan says that's enough. Them calling out by name. Reish Lakish, Reb Shimon ben Lakish says no. It has to be they called out someone by name, and that person is already guilty for a crime deserving of death. But if not, then, as I said before, you're not allowed to be accomplice to murder. So really, there's two ways. I don't want to get too far into this, but really, there's two ways of understanding the issue. One is, how do you choose? So that's why we can't hand over someone. That's Rabbi Yochanan Shitta. So in that case, the answer is, but if they name someone, so then we can hand over the one person to save many. Reb Shimon ben Lakish's point is not how do you choose. Reb Shimon ben Lakish's point is, you can never be an accomplice to murder, period. Good. So that's the Gemara over there. So he basically says, let's follow Rabbi Yochanan. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, if they label one person, you're allowed to hand them over. So the Jesuits are labeling one person. They're labeling the passages in Shas they don't want. They say, we don't want those things. Yichadu. We're not choosing, they're choosing. So just like there, you're allowed to hand over one to save the group. You're allowed to save the Shas. You're allowed to hand over those. See, that's the imagery he's using. Very creative. You're allowed to hand over those passages in Shas to the Jesuits, to the non-Jews, in order to save the rest of Shas. Then he goes on to say, I want to give you another argument. I want everyone to remember over here that when Chazal were doing Gemara, there was no print. It was all written in manuscript. And manuscript is more discreet. It's much more discreet. It's not so public. It's not all over the place. But it's been about 200 years, he says, that we've had having print. Right? The Bamberg Shas actually was printed mamish 200 years before this. So it's not the first printing of the Shas, but it's the first printing of the full Shas, mamish 200 years before this. And now it's good, because for Jews, books are easily available. But now it also has a problem that it's causing a lot of tension between the Jewish community and non-Jews. So why don't we just go back to the way it used to be? So in other words, what he's saying over here is, Moshe Chagiz, what are you going to say? You're going to say, you're changing the Gemara. I'm not changing Gemara. Let the Gemara and manuscript stay the way it originally was. These sections of the Gemara we're not printing. That's it. That's all we're saying. He quotes a Gemara Megillah. The Gemara Megillah says that Esther turned to the Chachamim and said, Kivuni l'doiris, I want my book of Esther to be part of the biblical canon v'mizakt. So the Chachamim said, no, that's going to cause enmity between the Jewish people and the non-Jewish people, this whole story of Haman and how the Jews prevailed. So they responded and said, it doesn't matter, because Esther responded, Kfar ksuva ani al divrei hayam l'machem ad afaras. Everyone knows my story already. It's not going to cause, it's open, they have it in their books, so you don't need to worry about it. So he says, what do you see from here? Had they not had it in their books, then you would have had a whole book that theoretically could have been in Tanakh, would not have been in Tanakh. So we would have been mashmit the whole book from Tanakh, not to cause enmity. So if we could mashmit a whole book from Tanakh, so then we could be mashmit, we could censor out certain passages. And he says, there you had Esther as queen. We don't have anyone as well connected. So certainly we should take a cue from that. Goes further and says, another argument. You know those ones where Torah Shabbat Peh wasn't written at all? Why did we write it? We wrote it because Eislas Hashem, we were going to forget it, so we made a special heter that we're allowed to write it. Oh, so in other words, we're thinking consequentially. You're thinking about what's good for the Jews, essentially. Okay, well now, what's good for the Jews? It's better for the Jews not to have this stuff written. So let's actually go, before he said, let's go back to manuscript. Now he's just saying, let's go back to the concept of this being Baal Peh and not being written, because the whole reason it was only taken out of Baal Peh and given as print was because that's what's good for the Jews. Well, now I can tell you what's better for the Jews is if we go back and let these things remain as oral teachings. Then he goes and quotes another Gemara. The Gemara has, Gemara Megillah Daf Tes Amud Aleph, Talmud HaMelech invited 72 sages to translate the Torah into Greek, and the Chachamim changed the Torah. And the miracle was that the changes all corresponded with each other, even though they weren't working together. And the Marshal actually asks a question. In his Yam Shel Shlomo, Baba Kama, the Marshal asks a question. How is that permitted? You're not allowed to change Torah. The Marshal has a shitta that says that you're not allowed to change Torah even if it means the worst. You're not allowed to change the text. So the Marshal gives two answers. One is, well, the very fact that God allowed all of them to reach the same conclusion means that essentially this was all Ruach HaKodesh, so don't learn from this story. That's the first answer Marshal gives. But then he gives another answer. They didn't change the meaning. They only changed the lashon, that it shouldn't be misunderstood. But ultimately, it didn't take away from what the pasuk was really trying to say. Their changes is actually what the pasuk was trying to say. So to say that change pater to chayiv, you're not allowed to do. But if it doesn't change pater to chayiv, and in fact you're doing a better job in keeping people away from misunderstandings, and you're conveying the true intent of the passage, then it was mutter for them. So he says, I take my cue from that. There are passages that people are misunderstanding. So we're going to actually tell them what the true meaning of it is. We're not saying on chayiv pater. Now it's interesting because you have to now go through each one of these changes and you have to say, okay, is this actually clarifying? Like a good example is God is more available in the Beis HaKnesses. A good argument could be made. That was the original intent, and so the wording is doing the same thing that Chachamim were doing with Talmud. But then when you start seeing qualifications that say Moshe Rabbeinu's request was only about then, only about us, only about that generation, and not future generations, so now you are changing meaning. So this becomes interesting, but this is what he's throwing a lot of things at the wall, including this Marshal over here. Then he goes further and says, now look, if this was a new thing, then fine, you can come to us with tainus. But this was done already. The Shas in Basel already had hashmatas. Many things were changed there. And not only things that were anti-Christian, even Agadata. I don't recall a lot of Agadata being censored in the Basel Talmud, but he mentions that here. And this didn't bother anyone. And then we had the Shas in Frankfurt. The Shas in Frankfurt, which I alluded to earlier, late 1600s, early 1700s, Frankfurt Oder, was essentially a reproduction of the Basel Shas. no one had a problem with that. All the Rabbanim were okay with it. Why? Because they understood that it's worth it. So why should this any be different? Now the Rabbanim there thought that the Basel Shas is going to work, the Frankfurt Shas is going to work. But the reality is it's not working. Why? Because the author of this memo is very in tune with what's going on. He says, who's involved in the printing? Frankfurt, the other, as I mentioned before, is a Lutheran town. So they're overseeing it. And Basel was also Lutheran, and Bechlal wasn't even part of the same empire. And they're not listening so much to the Pope. And so it's not good enough to fit into the Catholic situation. So we have no choice. We need to take the next step, and we have an opportunity now. Mitzvah. This is something that we need to do right now. This is the end of the Psak Din. Now back to the memo that introduced the Psak Din. So the memo now says, once we received the Psak Din, so we said, let's try one more time. We went to the government ministers, they calls them the consistorium, and we said, come on, let us keep everything the way it is, except if it's anti-Christian. They said, no, it doesn't work like that. Anything that's on the list is anti-Christian. Even if you don't see it's anti-Christian, it's still anti-Christian. And so therefore, no. But they said, you want another shot, another round to debate this? Because remember, there was already a debate before the list. You want another round to debate? No problem, we'll give you another round. So we did another round, and we saved many things that they wanted to get rid of, but the Tanai was that we have to write commentary. So basically, there's a debate, and we say, no, this is the pshat, you're misunderstanding it. So they say, well, it doesn't say that in the Gemara, how are fellow Jews going to know it? So he says, okay, we'll put it in the back of the Gemara. And this is what happens, and with this, the memorandum concludes. And so what happens here? What happens here is, we saw Ramosha Chagiz is very unhappy. And if you recall, he said that his snatzlos is all mirage, it's all fake, it's not real, don't take it seriously. Well, so now you see, l'chayra, he was referring to this. He was referring to this memo that this Kirchheim found in the archives in Prague. And apparently Ramosha Chagiz saw this as well, but he's very unimpressed. And why he's unimpressed, if you go back to his note, we'll see a very interesting passage. He writes as follows, going back to his note, look at number 14. God forbid, he says, if there's going to be a decree, levar yatsa, if there's going to be a decree to burn our Gemaras, and the Jewish people are not going to have the power to overcome it, then nisbalaisa, we will endure it. We will suffer that outcome, just like this has happened before. Why? Because we're not going to be too worried about it, because Yadanu, Shasida, Lizbata, we know those Gzeiris, that you can't have Gemaras or we're burning Gemaras, they don't last. Hanisoyan Meichiach, history has shown that it doesn't last forever like that. Because Loyazav Hashem es Brisa v'chasta, God doesn't forsake us. But, he says, if you're going to mess around with the text, that's davar ha'omed ledoirei doiris. That's something that remains forever. Ve'ein biyadenu lekabaloisa, that we're not allowed to accept lo min avol miksasa. In other words, I much rather have no Gemaras than have tampered Gemaras. Because if you tamper the text, it's going to be that way forever. And by the way, there are changes that were made in the Basel Gemara that till today have never been changed back. Some have been changed back, but till today have not been changed back. So there's a lot of truth to what he's saying, and he doesn't like the idea of Haga. And he says we have to go on Mesiras Nefesh, Guf v'Nefesh, so that this doesn't happen. And then he says again, Chalila. So in other words, he doesn't want to say this, but still, Yoiser Toiv Nivchar v'Nikrav Din Sreifa. I much prefer Sreifa she'ena ela l'shah, which is only temporary. Mimasha nisbal inin haga. I rather Gemaras be burnt rather than having them censored. Okay. Now I need to make the following comment about this. We see his shitta. There is clearly a machloikas between the author of the memorandum and Ramosha Chagiz. We understand that. But I want to talk about the following. There's a scholar by the name of Pavel Masheko. This professor wrote a paper on this subject about 10 years ago, and it's a very good resource because a lot of, in fact, the whole manuscript of Moshe Chagiz's letter from the Gach HaLayesh, I'm only aware of it because of his article. However, in this article, he writes that Moshe Chagiz said that he wants this edition of Gemara Berachos that was printed in Prague, he wants it to be burnt. And he says it's better that we burn this Gemara Berachos than allow it to be censored. And he goes on to say this is a wild idea, because how often in Jewish history did you have a rabbi saying that you should burn a Jewish book? If you read the Hebrew, clearly this is not at all what's happening. At no point did he say that book should be burnt. He said it should be banned. What he is saying is the excuse coming out of Prague is they're going to burn all our Gemaras. I'd rather they burn all of our Gemaras, Chalila, he says. I'd rather they do that, not we. I'd rather they do that if you're saying that's your excuse to amend the Gemara. So I think that's something that needs to be revisited, because I don't think that's a correct reading of what Moshe Chagiz is saying. Okay, then he goes on to say that the great Reb David Oppenheim, the Rav in Prague, agrees that it's wrong to do this. But these Rishayim, he says, their chutzpah is that they let out a rumor that he and his Bezdin agreed. Well, yeah, we saw them saying that Reb David Oppenheim gathered the Kehila, and they said this is a good thing. So there's a machloikas and mitzias over here between a memorandum and between Rav Moshe Chagiz, whether Reb David Oppenheim and his Bezdin, whether they agreed or not. It's not uncommon in Jewish history to have, after someone passes away, a debate what his true position is. But it's also not so. It happens from time to time, even during a lifetime, where people make various claims about a Gadol B'Yisrael, and that's what we're having over here, various claims being made about what Reb David's actual position was over here. And now, that brings us to the $1 million question. The $1 million question is, who is responsible for this printing in Prague? Did I slip and say it? No? Okay, Baruch Hashem. So who is responsible for this printing in Prague? And who is also the author of this memorandum? So let's go to the Yavits. The Yavits, as you know probably, led a campaign, a very, very divisive campaign against Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, two of the great rabbanim of the 18th century in Central Europe. The Yavits claimed that Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz was associated in one way or another with these clandestine Shabtai Tzvi groups that did exist at that time, even though Shabtai Tzvi is a story of the 1660s, but he had influence, and he had groups, and he had Talmudim, and that were following various elements of his philosophy into the next century. And this led to a huge machloikas, terrible machloikas, which is not our topic at all today, and so we're not really going to talk much about it. But in that regard, the Yavits published a lot about Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz and made many, many accusations against him. And that includes this book called Sefer Hitzapkus that the Yavits published, where he writes about Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz as follows. Then, at that time, he created an alliance with the Bishop of Prague to print a Siddur and also a Gemara, and to impose a tax on all the Jews of Bohemia and Prague, to force them. The tax would be that they would all be forced to buy this Siddur and to buy this Shas by the price that the two of them set out. And they were going to divide the profits between them. And worse, or together with that, he went and changed the Nusach in the Siddur, and he also hechsir v'gara, he diminished, he removed, he compromised the lashon of the Shas, Kechol chefetz hakomer, everything that the komer wanted. Remember, we already saw in the memorandum name of the Jesuit Hasselbauer, who was in charge of the Jewish books in Prague. And essentially, what we're here, he's being called the Bishop of Prague. Okay, and essentially, the Yavits is saying that Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz is responsible for the edition, this edition of the Gemara in Prague. PM is Bohemia. That's the Yiddish way of saying Bohemia and Ashkenaz. So this was a big outcry. We know the outcry. We saw the outcry. So here we have a claim from the Yavits that it was Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz who was responsible for the Siddur, which we're not talking about today, and the Gemara, which we are talking about today. However, you can't run away with this to the bank, because when you have an enemy, you can't trust everything the enemy says about his enemy. And so it's a start, perhaps, but it's not going to be sufficient. So let's turn to the words that Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz himself says. He printed in 1763, right before he passed away, he printed his halacha sefer called Kresi U Plesi, which is halacha sefer on Yerideh. In the introduction to the Sefer, and it's not entirely clear to me even why he includes this paragraph, but he goes out of the way to include this paragraph. He talks about the fact that he worked very hard in his studies. At night, he would engage in Torah study, and during the day, he was involved in defending the Jews. How was he doing that? By nichnas v'yoytza, bechatzere hasarim v'koyane melumade noitzrim. He was in and out by the ministers, the government officials, as well as by the learned Christians, the Hebraists, debating with them about our Torah, because sachaku al isarim, because these ministers, these officials would mock and laugh about various things that they fabricated against us, and they libeled us. And I was like a lawyer defending these Jewish texts. I was revealing the secret meaning of these passages to explain and to justify and to substantiate the words of our Kadmonim. And thank God, this ultimately led to the fact that due to the wisdom that I had, and because I found chen in the eyes of these officials, they gave me permission to print the Gemara, which never happened before. Never happened before in Prague, or maybe never happened before, like he spoke about earlier, that the Catholic theologians, the Jesuits, etc., were doing this. So, in other words, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz is taking the credit for the printing of this Gemara. And notice, he didn't have to say it if he didn't want to say it. 1763 is many years later. He didn't have to write this, but he's proud of it. He feels like this was an amazing accomplishment. Now, he doesn't mention at all any censorship. And presumably the reason is because for him that was a small price to pay, so it's insignificant in the scheme of things, which would make sense. If you're for it, you're going to focus on the fact that this is an amazing accomplishment. If you're against it, you're going to focus on the censorship. And so now we have a name. It's Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz versus Rav Moshe Chagiz. Again, I don't know what Reb David Oppenheim held because there's conflicting reports about that, each one claiming him for their side. But here is the machlokes between Rav Moshe Chagiz and Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz about this particular Gemara. In fact, in the 1740s, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, years earlier, wrote a haskama to a Sefer Ma'adane Yomtiv and Divrei Chamudos, which was printed in 1745. And in his haskama, he writes that I already printed this in the back of my Gemara Berachos. I printed the work of the Ma'adane Yomtiv and Divrei Chamudos. It's not the same name. The name changed. It's Ma'adane, what was it? Ma'adane Melach and Lechem Chamudos is what it was originally called. For various reasons, in this print in 1745, the name changed, but it's the same work. So he's saying, I already printed that, but no one has a sefer anymore, no one has this work, and also I only did it for brachas, we need it for other mesechtas on Gemara as well. These guys are doing it, and that's great. And he clearly says, I printed this Gemara in brachas, and he adds a detail, I invested a lot of money into this. So he was really involved, not only on an editorial side, but also on the business side of this. Now, so we know that he's involved, and right away, now that you see the Pirushim in the back of the Gemara over there on the Agadata, it's very natural to suspect that the author, the anonymous author of those Pirushim was none other than Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. That would make a lot of sense. But still, you would want to have some evidence that this is the case. So we do have evidence. What's the evidence? Let's go back to this passage about Hashem being mispala. And we already saw that in the text of this Prague Gemara, which now we're going to call the Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz Gemara, we already saw over there that it was changed from mispala to mavakesh. And basically the Gemara is basically, in Rabbi Yonasan's reading, the Gemara is saying, what does God want? He wants that the Jewish people should do His will, so in that case they're going to be zoichet to get rachamim. Okay. In the back of the Gemara, there's a whole pirush where he explains why that the wording that he amended, that's tachet pshat in this Gemara. And so he explains, he gives it a little more beer in terms of what does it mean that Hashem is praying. There's a sefer called Shem Olam. The sefer Shem Olam is letters of Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. He has a student that asks him this question: what's pshat of this Gemara that Hashem is mispalal? And to the student, he responds in a letter, I already explained in the Gemara in Prague, I already said, and he gives the same exact beer that you have over there in the back of the Gemara, demonstrating two things. Number one, he's the author of the material on the back of the Gemara. Number two, don't think that he's not proud of that. In other words, I've seen writers say, you shouldn't learn that because it's censorship, so he's not standing behind it. Don't take that stuff seriously in the back over there. Well, if he's writing this to a student of his, this same exact pirush, Mom is using the same words, the same phrases, quoting the same psukim. Clearly, not only he's the author, he's also very proud of it. It's something that he wants to stand behind. Okay, so that tells us he's the author of that in the back. What about this memo? What about the memo? So, if you remember earlier, the memo has two parts. One is giving the whole history and the whole background, and then it leads into saying, and here is the psak din of the Rabbanim of Prague. So really it has two questions. Number one, who wrote the memo? Number two, who wrote the psak din of the Rabbanim of Prague? Now here's the thing. In the psak din of the Rabbanim of Prague, it opened with dividing Torah into 4 sections. And what was section number 3? Section number 3 was about asmachta, was about the drashas of Chazal when they invoke psukim, but it's not really the psukim. They're only using it as a mnemonic to remember. It's a trick for memory, but it's not really being extracted from the pasuk. And I told you then that section quoted 4 Rishonim to back it up: the Kuzri, Rabbi Yeshaya Achron, the Rashba, and Rabbeinu Yoina. Well, if you open that Prague edition, Rabbi Yonasson's edition of Maseches Berachos, and you go to the Pirush HaGodis, and basically the first time there's a pasuk that is like, you look at that, you're like, really? That's the meaning of this pasuk? Is that really the meaning of this pasuk? So there's a Aga on the side that says, see the back, and you go to the back, and there's a shtickle over there, and the author over there says, when Chazal use a pasuk, sometimes it's just an asmachta, and asmachta is only a means for memory. And he goes on to quote 4 Rishonim in the exact same order. Kuzri number 1, Yeshaya Acher number 2, the Rashba number 3, and Rabbi Yoina number 4. And again, the word is a perfect match. So in other words, we already know who wrote the stuff in the back of the Gemara, Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz. That same language is in what? Is in the Psak Din. Forget the memorandum. Is in the Psak Din of Rabbanim of Prague. So I think once you know that, the most logical conclusion is that Rabbi Yonason wrote the whole thing. He wrote the whole thing. He wrote the memo. He also wrote the Psak Din. Maybe he was tasked to do that. He's a member of the Bet. He's like a Rav in Prague. Maybe he was tasked to do that. That again, that's a little not clear exactly, but I think we do know enough to know that he wrote that he wrote the entire thing, and that's the story of this Maseches Berachos. So let's tie this all together right now and try to understand essentially what happened over here. But first, I want to say the following: this scholar that I mentioned before, Paul Masheko, in this aforementioned article, he goes on to. I think this is one of the big ideas of his article. He goes on to say that Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz was in on this. And what he means by that is Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz wanted the censorship. It wasn't only coming from the Jesuits. Rabbi Yonason wanted this on his own as well. Why? So he points to the fact that in this memorandum, which he assumes, and I think rightfully so, was written by Rabbi Yonason, it mentions a few times Galui l'chol ha'amim, that we're printing this book, Galui l'chol ha'amim. So he teaches Galui l'chol ha'amim means that Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz wanted that the Goyim should learn, non-Jews should learn Gemara. And because he's tied that non-Jews should learn Gemara, so you need to clean it up a little. And so many of the amendments are not really even coming from the Jesuits. It's Rabbi Yonason saying, let's clean up this Gemara and make it more suitable for a Gentile audience. This is a very, very difficult thing to say. Galui l'chol ha'amim appears on the title page. The context is very clear. Till now, Gemaras are illegal over here. And it's very normal in rabbinic Hebrew to say you want something to be galui l'chol ha'amim means we want it to be open, we want it to be legal, we don't want to hide this, anything. To touch galui l'chol ha'amim means as a desire to have Gentiles study this is also, I think, is a big tzarachian that deserves to be revisited. Okay, so now let's tie this whole thing up. The bottom line is like this. Really, go big picture. If you think about it, you have a debate over here, and it's a very interesting debate in Jewish history. And I'm sure there are parallels in other areas in Jewish history. That is, there's a certain element of persecution. And the non-Jews say, well, if you change this, then we're good. What do you do? What do you do? Do you say, let's go ahead and let's change this? It could be a behavior. It could be a belief. It could be a text. It could be a social norm that whatever it may be. Or do you say, no, we're not. We're not budging. We're not changing. And this throughout history has happened many different times. Here, uniquely, you have it about a text. Here, uniquely, you have it about a text. So, Rav Moshe Chagiz's position, we understand his position very well. You mess up with the text, I don't know what's going to be, firstly, en l'davar soif. What's going to be next? Today is Gemara, maybe tomorrow it's going to be other things. And it also sticks around, and it ruins things forever. On the other hand, the Yonis and Abishitz made a whole bunch of arguments. Sometimes we do sacrifice, sometimes we do compromise. I think it's a very interesting debate. I think it's a very interesting argument about how Am Yisrael survives in galus. Ultimately, Reb David Oppenheimer mentioned his position. I don't know. I don't have clarity on that. I will say that I think Jewish history has paskined like Rav Moshe Chagiz here. In the sense, not that all censorship is bad. Remember, it has happened from time to time. But the fact is that after Maseches Berachos, a second Masechta on that level of censorship did not happen. It stopped. And it never happened again. A level of censorship so comprehensive and so deep never happened again. In Prague, they did continue printing Gemaras a few years later, but it was back to this, somehow they got the Frankfurt model, they got the Basel model with that more mild form of censorship, and that's pretty much has been the continuation. So I think you could say that looking back, Jewish history kind of sided more with Rav Moshe Chagiz than with Rabbi Yonis and Eibeshitz. And this story, like many other stories, is a reminder of the difficulties of galus, and let us hope that the difficulties of galus be mitigated, and that even when we're in galus, things should be great. Alachas kama kama with the Geula Shlema.